After all this time, we're finally getting a black woman to be a part of the Supreme Court of the United States. After all those pretty heated Supreme Court hearings, this is finally going to happen. Given the newfound interest in the court due to those hearings, as well as many other issues with the Supreme Court people have, I felt that it would be best to reminisce on the past and take a look at the many people who helped pave the way to Justice Jackson, and count down the top 9 justices that have been on the Supreme Court. The reason why it's not an even 10 is because 9 justices, 9 slots. If you haven't been clued in, this is probably going to be an opinion-based video, as I'm looking with the judges that coincide with me based on their judicial philosophy and the decisions that they made while on the court. So given your political views, you're probably going to disagree with me. To which I say, maybe your choices should have been better. With that out of the way, here are the top 9 Supreme Court justices in U.S. history. Number 9, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the notorious RBG herself. Now before you get mad at me, let me explain. I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg has a very similar issue to the Kennedys. It's not that she's particularly too bad. Her emphasis on feminism was very beneficial in cases like Safford Unified School District v. Reading, where she was able to convince her colleagues that the school went too far in a strip searching of a 13-year-old girl. I mean, to be fair, I thought that was kind of obvious decision, but okay. But much like the Kennedys, RBG sort of has a folk hero status that essentially leads to a lot of whitewashing of her record. And a deeper dive will show that she's not exactly the liberal icon as many people say she is. Well, okay, I mean, depending on your definition of liberal, maybe she is that. I remember watching a documentary about her where she point-blank stated that her being considered as like the far-left member of the court wasn't due to her own decisions. It was because the court moved rightward, so she on the surface looked further left. And the biggest flaw that most people on the left would probably give her is her issues revolving around Native Americans. From saying that a Native American tribe had no jurisdiction in a crash that happened in their own land, citing the doctrine of discovery to pretty much say, hey, it's our land now, sorry, and pretty much every single ruling that she did regarding a pipeline that would go through Native American land. Yeah, the media sort of pushing her to be this like, oh, super far left type person was probably a bit too presumptuous. Now, she's on this list despite those criticisms because Ruth Bader Ginsburg did do a lot of good on the court, as I stated a little bit in the blurb, but I also felt that maybe I should have at least one of the female justices on this list, and of those choices, I can really only put Ginsburg on the list. Not saying she doesn't deserve the spot, but I'm just saying. Number 8, Harry Blackmun. Blackmun is an interesting guy, as he was appointed by a conservative president to basically warm up the seat for someone who definitely will not be making on this list. And he was originally going to be in that vein of being a conservative justice. But similar to Ginsburg, as the court shifted right, he started getting a bit more worried and made a little bit of a leftward shift. I mean, arguably he made a very decently leftward shift, seeing that a lot of the conservative justices were trying to stick their noses in people's personal lives. One of the biggest examples is in the case of Bowers v. Hardwick, the case where conservatives on the court upheld a ban on gay sex. The very, very, very important issue that everybody should be focusing on. But of course, one of the biggest decisions that he made on the court, which is one that you probably know about, especially in the recent Supreme Court hearings, is Roe v. Wade. Blackmun not only signing on to one of the most important SCOTUS decisions in U.S. history, but also
when I wrote the damn
opinion.
That's pretty much all there really is to say on him. He was better than most, wrote one of the most important opinions. Next, number 7, Frank Murphy. One of the issues that came to making this list was actually revolving around the New Deal era justices, as a lot of them basically sort of blended in with each other and stayed on there for relatively short amounts of time. So even though objectively some of them are probably better than most other justices that I put on the list, I had to basically stick to the ones that had a very decent tenure, and Murphy easily rises to the top of FDR's justices for 2 primary reasons. 1, he's just a bit further to the left than most of them, and 2, not only did he dissent on the Korematsu case, but he was also the only dissenter to use the dreaded R word. In his first line, no doubt, "I dissent, therefore, from this legalization of racism." Wait, you guys knew that's the word I meant, right? Murphy always seemed to have a focus on helping out the little guy, stating, "The law knows no finer hour than when it cuts through formal concepts and transitionatory emotions to protect unpopular citizens against discrimination and persecution." He even wanted to do a little bit more than just be a justice on the Supreme Court, both serving in the military and during the court's recess, forming the National Committee Against Nazi Persecution and Extermination of the Jews, so the term judicial activist definitely seems to fit him. Number 6. Earl Warren, the only Chief Justice to make it on the list, and it makes sense that it's Warren. Warren became sort of the face of the left wing of the court, being the one who led on many of the major decisions during the 50s and 60s. In fact, Warren is sort of the reason why, during that time period, conservatives pretended that they hated the Supreme Court. Of course, one of the biggest decisions he had a hand in, which led to this issue, was his decision regarding Brown v. Board of Education. That wasn't the only one, but that was definitely one of the biggest ones that put him in the crosshairs of the far right, like the John Birch Society and Barry Goldwater. Another decision that was very controversial at the time, but he made the correct choice, was in Yates v. United States, when he ruled that communists have the right to exist and not get jailed. That decision made the far right demand that Warren be impeached from the court. Another Supreme Court case that pretty much ruined the entire veneer of the 50s era America was when he ruled in Engel v. Vitale that mandatory prayer in school was not allowed. Despite all the hate that he got, nevertheless, he persisted. Number 5. Abe Fortas. Fortas served a similar duty to the New Deal justices, but instead for LBJ's Great Society. But don't think that defines him, even though I literally just defined him that way. The way he wanted to define himself was having a particular forefront issue that he would tackle, that issue being youth rights. The two biggest examples were in Tinker v. Des Moines, when he argued that students absolutely had First Amendment rights to protest, but in another case called In Re Galt, where he literally changed how we try minors, adding due process and saying, maybe the system where we keep them incarcerated until they're 21 is a pretty bad way to run things. Again, I think that that's kind of a no-brainer decision, but I guess Abe had to suggest it before it became commonplace. Another interesting thing what happened regarding Abe was when LBJ was going to appoint him to be the Chief Justice. A person that you may be familiar with by the name of Strom Thurmond vehemently disagreed with Fortas. And believe it or not, it's not going to be for what you think it is. You see, the disagreement came from the fact that Fortas, in certain court cases, argued that due to the First Amendment, porn should be legal for Americans to consume. Wait, it gets better. Strom wanted to prove that Fortas was in the wrong so bad that he literally played porn in the Senate chamber and called it the Fortas Film Festival, and even got them submitted into congressional record. And to discredit Fortas even more, he specifically sought out gay porn and rape porn. Look, even if that was the only thing involving Fortas, he would have still made the list, because the fact that this happened is just hilarious. Number 4. William J. Brennan. Brennan was well known for being one of the leading progressive voices on the court. Like many of the other left court members, he was a vocal advocate of the Bill of Rights, an example of him writing in the ruling of New York Times Co. v. Sullivan, where he argued basically, just because you don't like what they print doesn't mean it's slander. Another issue Brennan took a hardline stance on was the death penalty, arguing that it was in and of itself a cruel and unusual punishment, and we should just scrap it entirely. He got more active in hardline as his career went on, and the court got steadily more right-wing. He became a louder voice for his issues. Although Brennan himself argued that his most important case that he was involved with was Goldberg v. Kelly, where he ruled that the U.S. government can't just take away a person's welfare benefits for no reason, that they need to hold an actual trial to decide whether or not that was a thing that you could do. Brennan was so prominent that he was called by Scalia probably the most influential justice of the 20th century, which forces me to say that I agree with Scalia. Number 3, Louis Brandeis. Brandeis was a very controversial choice for the court when he was first appointed. As his successor stated, Brandeis was a militant crusader for social justice, whoever his opponent might be. He was dangerous not only because of his brilliance, his arithmetic, his courage. He was dangerous because he was incorruptible, and the fears of the establishment were greater because Brandeis was the first Jew to be named to the court. Just by that statement alone, you could probably tell why he's so high on the list. Prior to joining the Supreme Court, he was known as the people's lawyer and even created the idea of the right to privacy. So he was a natural choice for a progressive era judge. Like most progressive justices, he usually focused on people's rights. Some of his most notable cases were in Olmsted v. United States, where he dissented that the government did not have the right to use information obtained through illegally wiretapped phones, and the second one came from Whitney v. California, where he argued that members of the Communist Labor Party who actively try to overthrow the US government should go to jail, but the ones who merely advocate it should not because it's a free speech issue. Fear of serious injury cannot alone justify suppression of free speech and assembly. Men feared witches and burned women. It is the function of free speech to free men from bondage of irrational fears. Those who won our independence by revolution were not cowards. They did not fear political change. They did not exalt order at the cost of liberty. This guy really did live up to the name People's Lawyer. Number 2, Thurgood Marshall. Marshall is of course notable for being the first African American justice to serve on the Supreme Court. But don't think that's the only thing that gets him here. No. Marshall's judicial philosophy, described in his own words, also helps. You do what you think is right and let the law catch up. And his rulings show just that. Not only with his primary focus on individual/civil rights and reforming criminal procedure, such as viewing the death penalty as unconstitutional in and of itself, but also with lesser-known issues, like when he ruled that if a union failed to represent every single employee equally, they had the right to go to court. Marshall's viewpoints also put him at odds with many people throughout his judicial career, especially when he gave a very blunt statement at the American Bicentennial, saying, "The government they devised was defective from the start, requiring several amendments, a civil war, and major social transformation to attain the system of constitutional government, and its respect for the individual freedoms and human rights we hold as fundamental today." Marshall made that speech during the American Bicentennial. Many people still think we haven't gotten to the point where we can say that in the American Tricentennial. Overall, Thurgood really has a very notable place in Supreme Court history. In fact, you could actually make the case that Thurgood should probably be number 1. But of course, someone else made it there. Number 1, William O. Douglas. Douglas is a very interesting person ideologically, at least for the court. He's been described as the most doctrinaire and committed civil libertarian ever to sit on the court. And if you don't believe me that Douglas is interesting ideologically, look at this. He's essentially off the spectrum. Needless to say, his 36-year tenure did not disappoint. One of the biggest differences that set him apart from most other people on the court is that he based his decisions mostly on a philosophical standpoint rather than legal jargon. Much like the rest of the courts left, he loved the First Amendment, even to the point of being one of the 2 dissenters in Dennis v. United States, basically saying, "No duh, communists have the right to free speech." Another example was when he tried to stop the executions of the Rosenbergs. Yes, I know they ended up being guilty, but guess what? I'm still anti-death penalty. Douglas was also a huge environmentalist, even arguing that trees have the right to stand for themselves in court, again, from a philosophical point of view. And much like Murphy, he seemed to also take the activist part of a judicial activist into a very interesting direction, being openly vocal on political issues, such as the Vietnam War, being a huge critic of it. In fact, he was so prominent for his political views that Roosevelt actually considered him to be a running mate, proving, once again, the court has always been political. Overall, I really do think that Douglas probably is the best Supreme Court justice we've had, and arguably we need more justices like him. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to be notified when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, check out my articles on the Independent Political Report, or consider supporting me on Patreon.